Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and also welcome if you are new. My name is Akua and here on this channel I cover all things faith, culture and encouragement. And in today's video I'm going to be covering a video that has gone slightly viral, especially in the Christian sphere of things. It is Jordan Peterson versus 20 atheists. And I was actually a bit curious when I saw this video come up because I was thinking it's Jordan Peterson versus 20 atheists. Is he aligning himself with Christians? How does that work? Because if it's versus, it does mean that, you know, there's some kind of opposition there's some kind of disagreement potentially. So I'm not really sure where this is going to lead. I've had quite a long history watching Jordan Peterson's materials on YouTube especially. I've not yet read his books, but I found his content quite interesting when I first came across him, and I think it was just the way that he had such wisdom about life that really drew me in, and the way that he was able to be vulnerable and emotionally present but also have a level of depth and grounded reality in what he was saying as well. And I think that's just his professionalism coming through in his, profession as a psychologist. So yeah, that is the kind of brief history that I've had watching Jordan Peterson's stuff. I love, learning things. I love learning more about wisdom and things like that, and he's definitely somebody who I could say I've learned quite a lot from. However, in terms of Christianity and his perspective on faith, I think that has been something that I have took a step back from in terms of engaging with his content on those things as much. And it's not to say that he doesn't have great things to say or great opinions and great work around biblical themes and things like that in Christianity. I think it's more so that I don't necessarily want to place myself under him as a teacher or a thinker in terms of the Christian leaders space, just because he doesn't openly profess that he is a Christian, or at least as far as I'm aware. So that is kind of what pulled me into this video. I want to see if he's fleshed out his opinions and his beliefs more, and just to be able to see kind of where he places himself in this discussion. So he might not actually come to a solid decision at the end of this debate, but it will be interesting just to see how his ideas and beliefs have developed since my initial watching of him and him starting to talk more openly about faith and things like that. So yeah, that is a bit of history there. Let's crack on straight into the video. It is a reaction and a commentary, so I'll be providing some commentary throughout, maybe my own thoughts, pausing it, just chatting through some interesting things that are said. And yeah, make sure to leave your thoughts down below. Make sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you have not already. There's a lot of you guys that have not subscribed yet. And without further ado, let's get straight into today's reaction.
You're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
Don't be a smartass.
Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing. Right, you're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with you.
Oh my goodness. Wow. You know what's interesting? We don't have common human decency a lot anymore on the internet. Like, truly. And this is so volatile immediately. Like, oh, wow.
Hello there. I'm Dr. Jordan Peterson. I'm a clinical psychologist, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, an author, a podcaster, public speaker, and today I'm surrounded by 25 atheists.
Interesting. Let's get into it.
My first claim: atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Interesting. Oh, people were ready.
Good afternoon, Dr. Peterson.
How are you doing?
So this claim here that atheists don't know what they're rejecting. My background is in studying to become a traditional Catholic priest, daily mass, daily rosary, going on long retreats, deep into the magisterium and biblical hermeneutics, like I was thoroughly in it. And it seems like I do know what I'm missing. Is there something that I missed over years of study, both this issue formally and living out religion so deeply?
That's interesting. Before Jordan Peterson responds, I just noticed, and I think a lot of people do this, especially when I've heard of people who've had religious upbringings or backgrounds, they talk a lot about what they did and not about who God is. They don't talk about their relationship with God. They talk about the things that they did in that time period that they were a believer or as they were a Christian. So it's interesting that he listed those things rather than I'm rejecting Jesus or I'm rejecting an idea of God. It's more so I did this, I did that, I did this. So let's see what Jordan Peterson says.
Well, you obviously feel that you missed something when you were practicing for the priesthood. Your aim was off then. So there's always the possibility that it's still off now.
What was off about my aim in the first place?
I don't know. That might take a long time to figure out.
But it seems kind of like this no true Scotsman type of fallacy in which you're the arbiter of people's aims and how they understand those aims to be. How is it that you can claim that people don't know something that you know about their life despite not having met them?
Well, it's obviously a generic claim, just like the atheist claim that there's no God is a generic claim. In your case, it would have to be specified more, and I'm not claiming to understand what was going on in your mind, but my experience with atheists is twofold, is that they have a very reductive notion of what constitutes God, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they've often been hurt by someone who was religious or by the religious enterprise or perhaps by God himself, so to speak, and that's left them with an animus.
But I think that you have a reductive view of what atheism is. You've defined religion so broadly to include any sort of having aim in life, any sort of cultural archetypes or having a metaphorical substrate. And atheism to you is a very specific type of like three people in the world that are these Raskolnikov type of, they want to get away with a perfect murder. It seems like you have the reductive view of what an atheist is.
Well, let's start with your claim. How do you define the God that you're rejecting? Like, what is God to you? You studied in the church, you found that unsatisfactory. How would you characterize what you rejected?
I think the average Christian believer, when they say that they're Christian and they believe, they mean some sort of God that is all-powerful, all-perfect, is somehow involved in the matters of this world, and that we look to them through wisdom and with Logos incarnate in Christ. And it also seems like you don't believe in religion in the way that the average Christian says that they believe in religion. And there are as many gods out there as there are believers, because everybody has mutually exclusive and different views of what God is. So it seems
well,
like...
if everybody had mutually exclusive views of what God is, no one could speak to each other. The mere fact of communication presumes a commonality of assumption and definition. And it's certainly not the case that I regard any archetypal manifestation whatsoever as equally religious. So that's not a real claim. Let me give you an example. For example, there's a sub-narrative in the story of Moses where Moses is rewarded with a glimpse of God. Okay, and that's one of the ways that God is characterized in the Old Testament stories.
Yes.
Now, Moses is a faithful servant of God and a good man. At least that's the case within the confines of the story.
One possible interpretation.
It's the case within the confines of the story, obviously.
Obviously. When we look at the Bible can't precisely say anything because there are so many different exegetical and hermeneutic views of this particular book, and that everybody has agreed.
You know, something that I've learned over my time of being a Christian, over my short 6 years-ish, is that sometimes people genuinely, in their own understanding or lack thereof, and I found this a lot, I'm not trying to say this to be any kind of patronizing, but because I've done it myself, people project their beliefs or lack thereof onto others. They project their perception onto others, and people do this in all areas of life. But I have found this in terms of listening to people have apologetics debates and different things like that. And when it comes to this is what I see here, is that you can't define anything. The Bible can't decisively say anything. That is confusing, because that you can extrapolate that to anything that we understand in the world, because everything, even something as objective as we like to think as science, you can interpret it different ways depending on the context and the application. Like, this whole world does rely on consistency, being able to identify patterns, being able to decisively categorize things and come to solid conclusions. So saying that just because it's a religious text that you can't come to objective and solid conclusions is, I think, deceptive and not faithful.
Everybody has disagreed historically on, it seems like, even the most benign detail about a book this big, and it seems like you can only say that the Bible says something if you first presuppose that it's univocal.
So your claim essentially is that Moses in the Old Testament plays the role of the villain or is irrelevant? Because the alternative claim
I'm saying
is
that we
he's
can't
good.
know, because we can't talk to those authors.
If you are going to start with the presupposition that there's nothing I can say about any of these stories that you're not going to disagree with from the perspective that there are multiple potential competing claims, then I can't speak with you. So
we also have a short time here, so I want to get to the core of what you're arguing here, and I'd love if we could...
The core of what I'm arguing is that atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. So I'm trying to give you an example of what's being rejected and its complexity. Okay, so God rewards Moses with a glimpse of the divine. So this is a definition of the God that atheists are hypothetically rejecting.
A possible one.
I said I didn't say the. I said
Well, you know what's really sad? Like, I love apologetics, and there used to be a time when I was like so fiery in terms of wanting to just argue with everyone about every little thing. And I didn't do it all the time, but it was like in my head, I was like burning in my heart. I was like, I've got to prove them wrong. I've got to show them that I know this and that, the Bible says this. And if people don't want to listen, they will not listen. It says in the Bible, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear. It says in the Bible, do not argue with somebody in nonsense, because you will also become someone that is spewing nonsense. Like, if you cannot come to a peaceful conclusion, agree to disagree, if you cannot even talk to someone in a respectable manner, then you can't talk. Like, I think nowadays we've really lost the art of being able to talk with someone or debate with someone respectfully, being able to have a discussion with someone and you not see eye to eye at the end of it, but then you don't have to go into it like kind of trying to just nip at the heels of them. Like, can we just talk and actually listen and then respond instead of reacting? Because I think that the individual that's talking with Jordan Peterson now, it kind of feels like they're just in that combative state instead of actually trying to sit down and digest and listen and discuss, because they could have some really amazing thoughts and things to chew on for the audience and the other atheists in the circle to listen to, or even Jordan Peterson to mull over. But I don't feel like there's a clear line of argument from him. He's just saying we can't know anything because things aren't clear. And that's all I'm getting from it right now. Let me know if you think different.
It's possible, yes.
Okay. So despite the fact that Moses is a stellar character and he's had a long and difficult life and can withstand a lot of difficulty and travail, God puts him between two cliffs so he can just see a crack of what's in front of him. And when God walks by, he allows him to see his back. Okay, so the implication of that story is that the divine is fundamentally unknowable. It's a pinnacle experience, and that people in their finitude have to be shielded from a comprehensive vision of the basis of reality. Well, that's not the God that's defined in that manner, right? It's not a simple personification. It's not a simple old man in the sky. It's something that in its essence is unknowable and overwhelming. And that isn't, in my experience, the God that's defined by atheists who are attempting to undermine the story. I mean, it's the same claim, for example, that you're a finite creature and that you face something that in the final analysis is unknowable, and that you have to establish a relationship with it regardless of your inability to perceive or even withstand perceiving the whole. Okay, is there a problem with that?
I mean, the problem is that when we look at, famously, when you've been asked, do you believe in God? The question becomes, what do we mean by God? And in the Bible, it's not even clear the biblical authors know what God is, because Yahweh has historically emerged from an early storm god, a deity that doesn't exhaust the category of deity, and that has changed over the Old Testament. Does God have physicality? Does God not have physicality? It seems like, yes, if you define religion to mean anybody that has an aim, anybody that looks at the unknown, anybody who wants to go from chaos to order is inherently religious, then yes. But also in the same way, I could define atheist as somebody who doesn't dogmatically believe in a religion, or somebody who doesn't regularly attend religious services or belong to a denomination. To help especially the audience kind of like boil this down, there was a lot of words there. That the central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
A central claim.
A central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
No, I said that we were finite and we had to establish a relationship with the infinite.
Yeah, then in that case, then we're all religious, but then I can do the same thing and define one particular element of atheism. It seems like we both have a reductive view of what the other side looks like, to the point where a conversation seems incoherent, and not just incoherent, but not in the way that the average Christian understands Christianity to be.
Do you have a problem?
Let's pause there. Sorry, you've been voted out by the majority.
That was not fruitful. That was not fruitful. Like, what was that? What was that? What was that? Like, what? Huh? Anyway, let's continue. Let me not judge too early.
Hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you.
Give the ladies a chance,
David,
guys.
good to see you.
Tell me everything that you know about the Polynesian deity Lono, L-O-N-O.
I don't know anything about it. Polynesian deity Lono.
So you're rejecting something without knowledge of what you're rejecting.
I'm not rejecting it. No more than I'm rejecting
Do you believe in
anything
Lono?
that I don't know anything about.
Do you believe in Lono? Do you believe that he is a deity that exists in the
Why
world?
are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Is this what this hour and a half is going to be? Just people trying to jump down his throat? Because we need to actually listen and understand, and we need to have thoughts here. I feel like this is just going to be a lot of fluff. I hope it's not. I hope we get some good arguments in here, but...
World exists in the universe, that exists in the existence of everything. Do you believe that Lono
I'll
is
answer
a
that
being?
question once you answer my question, which is, do I reject everything that I'm ignorant of? Because that's your presupposition that undergirds your argument, and unless you can prove that that's valid, then there's no point.
My question is quite simple.
Yeah, but that doesn't
Do
mean
you
it's
believe-
formulated accurately.
Do you believe that Lono exists? Yes or no?
I'm not going to answer that question for the reasons I just described. You already insisted that if I reject something, that if I'm ignorant of something, I reject it. Do you think that everyone in the world has to know everything simultaneously for that to be valid and true?
That's interesting. My camera cut out just before this guy came on, I think. It might have been just after, I didn't notice. But hopefully it included what I said just before. But that is interesting, and that is something that a lot of people, especially from other religions, when I've had conversations with people from different beliefs that have spoken to me about, like, if you have not read this holy book, or if you don't know this God, or if you've never tried this practice, how do you know that it's basically the age-old question, is there only one way to God? Is there only one correct religion? And the undergirding thought behind that is, am I in trouble if I'm not like you? And if I don't follow the God that you follow and serve him the way that you do? And ultimately, that is a very, very, very important question. I think the question that Jordan Peterson posed just then is also important, in saying that if you don't know something, does that mean that, that you're valid to reject it? And I think that is fine, because there's a lot of things that we don't know as humans. We cannot know every single thing. We can't know everybody in the world. We can't know every detail of intelligence in this world. Even AI still has to learn. Like, at this point, I know that, one day I'll probably know a lot more. But as humans, when we were not built by God to be him, we were not built to be God. Like, and that would ultimately be a contradiction, because God was never built, God was never created. So saying that we need to know everything to justify our positions is such a, I think you can brush that argument away very, very quickly, because nobody needs to know what every chair feels like to know which chair to buy for their living room. You don't have to know every human in the world to know which partner you should settle with and like build a life with. That is just not how the world works, and I think anybody with common sense can understand that. And faith, I understand the importance of it and how it's not as simple as picking a chair or even choosing somebody to spend the rest of your life with. However, I think the same principle is there. Like, you don't have to try everything for you to stick with something and ultimately to know that it's true. Let's see what this guy says.
I think in order for your argument to be true, in order for it to be true that we atheists don't understand what we're rejecting, then you need to also apply that to yourself and to Christians and to Muslims and to any other person on this earth, where if you don't understand what you're rejecting the belief in, then you can't reject the belief in it. That's the implication of your claim.
I didn't say that I rejected the belief in Lona. I said I didn't know who Lona was. I didn't say anything about rejecting.
That's because I've asked you several times and you haven't. But let me get to my even greater point.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying atheists don't understand what religion is or what God is in order to be able to reject it fully or completely. We have someone over here who studied it in their own way. I've studied religion. I have a degree in religious studies, specialty in Christianity and Mediterranean traditions. And further than that, beyond me, Pew Research studies suggest that atheists and agnostics actually know more about religion and about religious stories, the foundational principles, than believers.
That's because they're more religious than they think they are.
Okay. You can...
They're concerned with deep matters, and one of the defining characteristics of someone who's oriented in religious direction is that they're concerned with deep matters.
Okay.
In fact, it's virtually definition.
Right, but they also have to identify with a religious tradition and accept the foundational stories that go along
with that. Would mean more that they're sectarian than that they're religious. And most people, for example, in the United States, deny that they're religious but accept that they're spiritual.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Interesting. Let's see who's next. I'm curious.
Aha!
Oh! Where are the women? Why are we not trying? Put your little feet in there in the chair.
Hi, nice to meet you.
How are you
I want to
doing?
hear. I want to see if it's
I'm
different
great. Nice to
perspective.
meet you. Okay, so I feel like you're getting at this idea of polysemy, where we have multiple related meanings for a word, right? Like, for example, a famous painting can be emotionally moving in that it changes my emotional state. And when I was on the highway coming here to the studio, I was physically moving. I was changing my position. If I said, I believe the Mona Lisa is very moving, and you said, you don't really understand what you're saying, it's nailed to the wall, I would say that you're the one who doesn't understand what I'm saying, not the other way around. And the way that relates to this is there are many concepts of God, and I'll admit, I find a lot of what you say about that interesting. I'm familiar with it. The idea of this kind of Jungian hierarchical thing, or as a metaphor, or a symbol, or the kind of, atheist, materialist, literalist idea of a agentic, omnipotent, omniscient being that intervenes in reality, right? So when I'm saying that I reject the concept of God, I'm aware of these other definitions of God, but I think that when we use words, we tend to only imply one meaning at a time. So the same way that I would say the Mona Lisa is moving emotionally, but I would not say it's moving physically. I would say I reject the concept of God in this very literal way. But
what literal way?
The way that God is this omniscient, omnipotent, agentic, supernatural being that sent his son down and has, caused miracles and all these things like that. The idea of God is
Do you think that there's an underlying unity of things?
Could you explain that question?
Well, scientists, for example, believe that science unifies in a comprehensive theory. Do you, yes, no, or that
I know
there are
that people-
multiple competing truths? Those are the options. Either things unify or there are multiple competing truths.
I think that I know that, for example, like in physics, people are looking for like a theory of everything.
And why do you think they're doing that?
It's interesting. It's helpful.
But they also believe that there's an underlying unity to things.
In a sense, yeah. Like, like the material world and time and space are probably governed by universal laws and principles.
Partly that, yes, yes, but that the same thing might extend to a broader domain that would include imagination and value.
Could you help me connect that to the prompt?
Well, I'm trying to define God, the God that I don't think atheists do a very good job of defining. Here's another question for you. What do you think guides you in your determination of whether or not what you're saying to me is true?
Can we go back? Can we stay on what we were talking about?
We are.
Okay.
You're just uncomfortable with the question.
No, I feel like you're just kind of throwing different spaghetti at the wall.
I'm not.
Okay.
I asked
All
you a
right.
very specific question. What is it that you think guides you when you're talking to me to help you determine whether what you say is true?
Logic, memory, reasoning, sensory information.
How do you distinguish that from being governed by something that's false?
An interesting question.
How do you know the difference when you speak between what's true and what's false? So you could imagine
Infer, right? I can infer. I can.
from what principles?
So, and what are you getting at?
I'm getting at the fact that your conscience guides you. Is that
Okay.
reasonable?
Conscious is defined by
Conscience.
my empathy and my reason are my foundation.
Define it any way you want.
Okay, so that's how I'm defining my conscience. Is my my conscience is my sense of
Right and wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
does that come from?
I would say that comes from an evolved capacity to empathize and a recognition of the benefits of engaging with and nurturing that capacity. And then that empathy is constrained and guided by reason, right? Like, for example, I am driving down the highway, there's a kitten in the road. I'm going to empathetically feel, oh my God, I want to save the kitten. But then reasonably, like, I'm going to get hit by a car, right? So that's sort of the process through which I make ethical decisions.
Okay,
is
how do
empathy
you-
constrained by reason?
Do you think that people can differ in their response to something empathically?
Yeah. Like,
Is there a mediating principle that can tell you one person who's empathic and another person who's empathic that disagree who's correct?
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we'd have to, talk it out, right? We do that in real life all the time when we have, whether that's a discussion with a friend about the right thing to do in a situation, whether that's a policy discussion about law, right? That's where we can converse with each other, think about things, explain our perspectives, and then kind of reach a conclusion, right? That I think that we do that all the time.
So Elijah, the prophet Elijah, defined God in the Old Testament as the voice of conscience within.
Okay.
That's a definition.
So you're saying by that definition of God, I see. This kind of goes back to what I'm saying initially.
I'm not defining it. Elijah
Okay,
defined
so
it.
as Elijah defines
It's
God.
defined that way in Jonah too.
Okay, so as
Cardinal Newman also
got
defined
it.
it that
as,
way.
as I'm sure you know many people who defined it that way, and it's impressive. You're a very knowledgeable person.
I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm
okay.
just pointing out to you
Got
how
it.
God is defined in the Old
Okay.
Testament.
All right. So to respond to that, I do think there are lots of interesting ways to define God, and that goes back to my kind of opening
Then how do we
statement.
specify what we're arguing about?
We use context clues, or we again. It goes back to my example of the
I'm
Mona
defining
Lisa.
God as conscience.
Okay, so that's interesting, but then you're kind of expanding the meaning of
No,
God.
I'm not. That's how it's defined in the Old Testament.
Okay, so-
in Elijah and in Jonah.
Sure. So whoever. So
It's
some.
not whoever.
Okay.
Elijah is one of the
Okay.
major
All right.
Old Testament
All right.
prophets.
All
Right?
right.
He's equal in stature to
Can-
Moses.
okay.
Right. So it's not arbitrary.
All right. So that is interesting, but it's not relevant to the context with which I am using the term God.
It's directly relevant. Atheists reject God, but they don't
but
understand
you-
what they're rejecting.
you're
You
being-
accept conscience as a guide, and conscience is one of the defining characteristics of
I
God in the Old
I
Testament.
think you're being intellectually disingenuous
In what way?
because again,
I asked you if you believe that
you-
conscience
you
guided you.
just asked me a question and then you stopped me from answering it. In this setting, you understand the way I am using the term God and belief.
Not
and
in
then
the least. I don't understand how you're using it in the least. That's why I'm trying to define it. My definition of God as conscience is a lot more precise and oriented than your definition of the God that you
But
hypothetically disbelieve in.
it's irrelevant to the fault lines of this debate.
How is it irrelevant?
Because in common parlance, when we're talking about atheists, God, belief, not belief,
I
we're
don't
not
care
talking
about common parlance. I'm trying to get to something fundamental.
I think your point is irrelevant to the way that people tend
Which
to use
point?
these words. Your point that there are these polysemous
I didn't make
ideas
that
of God.
point. You did.
I did. Well, I made
a
I
specific
characterized
point
it,
that God
right.
was associated with conscience.
I just feel like you kind of retreat into this semantic fog.
I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating.
All right. Well, it was very nice.
This is interesting. You know, I need to watch more debates like this. I feel like there are some times when I feel like that guy is true. Like, I don't know whether it's because he's just so intellectually above the average person. I think sometimes listening to Jordan Peterson, I'm like, this is very like complex thoughts. And I think sometimes it takes a lot of patience and time to deduce what he's saying. But then also, if you try and follow his line of thought, you will get there and you'll understand where he's coming from. You might not necessarily understand perfectly what he's saying, but I think a lot of the things he says does make sense. But yeah, I feel like in this debate, especially, sometimes things are getting mixed up because of the pace of the conversation, the pace of the debate, plus the pressure and clarity of the prompts. They're always trying to get back to it. So yeah, let's see how the next person fares with this.
I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, it's very brave.
I would really love to see a more peaceful person come on to speak. And I don't mean peaceful, because you can be peaceful and passionate, but I mean as in like, I would like to see the next person actually have a bit more of a controlled conversation with Jordan Peterson instead of a very like combative one. I feel like that's what we've been getting so far. I'll react to a few more goes and then we'll make this into a part 2, I think.
Of you to do this.
Thank you.
Surrounded is now a podcast, available wherever you listen. Search Surrounded, plug in, and stay part of the conversation. Anywhere, anytime.
Switch my knee.
My next claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found within science.
This is so exciting! This is so exciting because I'm in the realm of science, I have my degree in science. This is so exciting, and I definitely agree with his question, with his prompt, that it cannot be found within science, because science is a tool. But I think sometimes we make science this god. We make science the be all and end all. Science is just a tool. Like, there are so many things that science cannot cover, and I don't think it will ever be able to cover precisely. And yeah, this is just one of those things. So let's have a gander and see who answers this prompt first. Mad Dash.
Where's Mr. Canada?
How you doing, man?
I'm doing great.
What's
How are
your
you?
name?
Brian. I think it's interesting that you say that morality and purpose can't be found in science. Actually,
No, within science.
sure. Purpose, I actually grant you, because purpose is subjective, right? Unless you want to boil it down to the purpose of life is just to procreate, right? Sure, whatever. Morality is actually something that we do see. We actually have examples of Neanderthals, an older individual was found in the tribe, missing an arm, missing teeth, still alive somehow in his 40s, 50s, right? Typically, you're a Neanderthal, you can't eat, you can't hunt, you die, right? But we know that members of the tribe were taking care of him, right? So we know that at some level, early in our evolutionary history, we actually developed altruism. We have examples of chimpanzees who actually have a basic understanding of fairness, right? If you give a chimpanzee 2 grapes, right, and his buddy gets 3, right? He actually freaks out, right? But you give both chimps 3 grapes and they're good. We have examples of parrots.
Except for the greedy chimps.
Except for the greedy chimps.
They want 4 grapes.
They want 4 grapes. Those do exist, right? But we have similar examples where we do animal tests, right? And
So morality is intrinsic.
I think
So it precedes science.
I think that actually
right?
a better way to define it would be that social animals, which we are, right,
Yeah.
require some level of morality or
Into what?
What I don't like is when we call humans animals. I don't know if that's just a semantic thing for me. I don't believe we're animals in the same way animals are animals. Like, I just can't. Like, we're humans. It's different. That's just a little tidbit from me. Anyway, let's continue to watch.
I'm not disagreeing.
Sure.
Why do they require that?
Because it's the only way that social groups can actually survive, right?
That's my point with
Sure.
regards to science. Thank you very much.
Is that
Precisely the point that you just made, that science has to exist within a moral framework that isn't in itself scientific.
How's that not scientific?
Well, because it's not derived from the scientific process, as you just
It
indicated.
doesn't need
by
to derive from
pointing
the
to-
scientific process.
Well,
It's
hang
the
on,
fact that
hang on a second.
we are social animals, so we need that to exist as a group.
I
right?
agree, but
Sure.
you pointed to the morality of Neanderthals, to the morality of chimpanzees. They didn't derive that from science.
They don't need to. That's not how
That's
that works.
my point.
Science explains it. So
No, science doesn't explain morality.
it doesn't explain how social animals would need to be.
Well, that's
altruistic.
a complicated question.
But we see it though.
Yeah, but explaining the evolution of morality and explaining morality itself aren't the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're asking why does this happen?
Yes, that's more accurate.
Because we're social animals and we
Yeah,
need
but there's
to be.
more to it than that.
Is there?
Sure. For example, so we're moral animals that have a sense of the future.
Sure.
Okay, that makes us unique, and that structures our morality.
No, actually, there are other animals that can predict the future, or not
Not
predict
really.
the future. No, tigers. Actually, there was a tiger at the SF Zoo that killed somebody, and so
Hunting
actually,
animals.
no. Kids threw shit at the tiger. The tiger actually plotted its escape, and it found the
I'm not
kids.
saying that animals can't think.
Okay,
No,
let's
but they
pause
can
here.
see the future. That's what I'm saying.
Well-
Voted out by the majority.
Thank you, man.
Good man.
I really hope we get a woman in there. I really hope. Yes, go.
Peterson, how you
How
doing?
you doing, man?
It's Luke. Nice to meet you.
See you, Luke.
So
get a woman in
your
there.
claim that morality and purpose can only be found in science is a little shaky because I think that your claim is really being framed to be morality and purpose can only be found in religion. Is that how you're kind of framing it?
I would say that the domain of religion is the domain of morality and purpose. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And also that science is actually structured, at least in part technically, to eliminate such considerations from its purview a priori.
Yeah.
Right? That's why we define science as value free. But that has to be wrong because scientists have to prioritize their attention towards something before they can even engage in observation.
Okay.
And that act of prioritization of attention is a value predicated act. And so I can continue. There's all sorts of things we have to assume
Yeah.
about science before it can take place.
Okay, so what I'm specifically pointing out here is about religion in particular, since you yourself are a Christian, right?
That's people debate about that, and I generally don't discuss it publicly.
Okay, I understand.
Why? Why don't you just be honest and open? Anyway.
And me myself, I am a former young Earth creationist fundamentalist.
Oh yeah.
So I have experience in this. I used to run a TikTok channel directed about apologetics about the Bible, specifically in this type of facet with morality,
Interesting.
evolution, and such, and going back and forth with that. So in the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in that, it teaches you how to take care of a slave, rather than saying slavery is wrong. I think
No,
it
it
should
says
say
that
that.
in the story of
It
Moses.
does.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says
Well,
it's immoral.
that's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
Yeah.
But why does the Bible predicate and tell people exactly how to take care of a slave?
Because when people would
Isn't
do
that
it-
immoral? Wouldn't you say that culturally we've evolved as a species, as he said earlier about empathy?
Yeah, I would say that the reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God.
Wouldn't you
And so
say
slavery itself became immoral, and that was established by Protestant Christians in the
Yes.
UK, who then convinced the
Yes.
UK government for 200 years to go to war on
And
slavery.
wouldn't you say that this is about the cultural evolution of humans in general, rather than just Christianity?
No, I think it's the
'Cause-
flowering of the ideas that were embedded in the biblical texts across long spans of time.
I feel like this is just humans editing based on the cultural evolution
What do you
of
mean by
morality.
just?
Just?
Yeah, just humans.
Well, humans.
Editing.
Well, based on culture and history, right? We get better.
Well, they
and-
did do it based on
See, like I
culture
would
and
have
history,
liked-
but
Yes.
culture and history have their foundations too. So
Well, yeah, but we're talking about slavery. So many people bolstered it based on the
everyone,
Bible. Based on the Bible,
that's
they looked at
much
it and
less
they
true.
justified it in the United States in the Deep South. They justified slavery.
Yeah, but the
based on
main
Bible.
thrust of Protestant thought in particular was stringently
Yes,
against slavery,
which-
and it was about the only movement in the history
Yes.
of the human race that
Yes.
had an anti-slavery direction.
which was driven by humans and their
Well,
understanding
that's one
of
way of
morality.
looking at it. Well, it depends.
It's the same with women's suffrage. I mean, women's in the patriarchy.
What do you mean it was driven by humans? Humans drove slavery too.
Yes, exactly. They
So there's no argument there. If slavery and
Yeah, it
anti-slavery
cancels
were
itself
both
out.
driven by humans, what
Yes.
does your claim that they were driven by humans have to do with it?
evolved
There was a
morality
specific-
based on the culture that within the society that they live in.
Okay,
So
fine.
with
I think
women's
that
suffrage
did
as well
happen.
as a very similar topic in the Bible, there are denominations in Christianity such as Pentecostal movement which do bolster women to be pastors, right? Which I think that's a great thing to do, but most like to disregard
Where do you
women.
think the idea that human beings were sufficiently equal to all vote and not be slaves came from?
Humans.
Yeah, but so did the idea of slavery.
So did the
that's
idea of God.
Fine, but what's
Yes.
your point? Like, you're not making an argument. You're just saying
Yeah.
all thoughts come from humans,
Yes.
regardless of the thoughts.
It's not driven by a higher power. It's driven on our experiences
Define
as
higher.
humans, which is what is best for all people.
Is it driven by conscience?
It could be. Which conscious is also something that has evolved over time, and I think that's
What's
something
the
that
other-
does evolve with morality and empathy.
Okay, I don't understand the point that you're making.
My point is that God influenced slavery. People looked at the Bible and went, "This is moral because God says so." Just like women's suffrage,
There's lots
and
of
just like homosexuality.
all human societies were slave owning, so you
Yes.
can't blame that on the Bible.
if humanity decided,
Oh wait, address that first.
What, about
All
slavery?
human societies were slavers, so you can't blame that on the Bible.
well, you can say it bolstered it.
Well, not if you look at the broad sweep of history, because it was the Protestant Christians
Based
in
on their
the UK.
interpretation of the Bible,
It was the Protestant
which
Christians in
evolves over time.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Well, it was great talking
Yeah,
with you,
nice
sir.
talking to you too.
Okay, let's listen to this last one and then I'll wrap up my filming for this section. I hope it's a woman.
Dr. Peterson?
Good to see you, man.
Pleasure.
What's your name?
Brian. So the first thing I would like to say is I would like to engage in this discussion in a symbiotic manner. I would not like to engage where there is one clear winner and one clear loser. Emotions are activated and it ultimately comes about ego. So I'm just saying I'm really trying to understand your position, and I would just like you to really try to understand my position.
Oh my gosh, this is what I've been waiting for. Someone who actually wants to engage in a normal discussion, not just like shouting and trying to one up the other person and ego.
Okay, sounds good. With that, if you're saying
Can you see how Jordan Peterson is immediately way more engaged? Can you see how the way he's leaning in, the way that he's attentive, the way that he's cocking his head. He wants to actually engage with this guy. I feel like some of the other people, he's been a bit more like fidgeting, moving his position, a bit more like, on edge. This time he's actually like, he's engaged. Yeah. I'm hopeful for this conversation.
that morality and purpose cannot come from science, is the opposite of that true, that morality and purpose can only come from God?
That's a way of defining it, yes.
Okay.
That's right, that's good. So I would say that with regard to the first claim, say, atheists don't understand what they're rejecting. Because I would say, by definition, God is the unity upon which moral claims are based. That's a
Okay.
definition, right?
Okay, if there is a God, what is the purpose of life?
Well, in the Christian tradition, the purpose of life is to engage in voluntary, upward, self-sacrifice so that the kingdom of heaven can be established on earth.
So you're trying to make it to heaven and avoid hell.
Yes, that's
Okay.
a good way of thinking about
What
it.
is the purpose of heaven? Do you understand? So here's the deal.
At
We
minimum,
can get
it's
into
the
an
opposite
infinite.
of endless suffering.
Ultimately, it's to glorify God. Let's just get to the root of it. We just want to glorify Him. We just want to magnify Him. We just want to serve Him. We just want to praise Him. And we should not be ashamed of that. I think sometimes we get wrapped up in this heaven, hell.
It's the opposite of endless suffering. How about that?
Okay, and so should we not try to achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth? And if we can achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth without
avoiding-
God,
you mean avoiding it.
avoiding it, if we can do that without God, then does that defeat your claim?
I think it's interesting. What I was saying, I just had to turn off my camera a second. But it's interesting how a lot of times when it comes to talks about like faith and religion and things like that, people want to bring it to heaven and hell. I think when you become a believer, you're way more focused on who God is and you're way more focused on that relationship with Him. You're not even thinking about hell for like 99% of the time that you're living. Like, I think there's the odd occasion, especially when I engage with other people, like non-believers, for example, where we'll talk about hell and things like that, or you'll come across it in scripture. but it's not something that you're living in constant thought about. And I think that is something that question kind of poses, like you're just living to avoid hell. But that's really not the case. And even though that is a blessing that comes with knowing and serving and being in relationship with Jesus, is that you're not going to hell, but it's also that that is not your constant thought. You're not living so that you can escape hell. You're living to glorify God, and it shifts your focus completely. When I wasn't a Christian, I was definitely thinking about hell way more frequently than I ever have as a Christian. And I think that's just because we know in our hearts that we were meant for eternity, but it's our body, it's our flesh, it's our mind that is like, what's going to happen to me? Like, what's going to happen? There's a question mark there. And I think as a believer, you don't just have an answer, but you have a security. You have, you're not just saying, I believe in this God, X, Y, Z God, which anybody can say, so therefore I'm not going to hell. But you actually have a security in what Jesus did to say that, yes, he's purchased my salvation by his blood that he shed on the cross. And through that sacrifice, that is what guarantees me being with him forever. So it's not something that does consume your mind. Let's see what else they're going to talk about in this conversation.
Well, yeah, except that it doesn't, you circumvented my initial definition, because I said that by definition, God was the unified source of morality. And so if we engage in a moral exercise...
And when you're talking about morality, though, when you really reverse engineer it and you get it down to its root, you're a psychologist, it really seems like it just has to deal with motivation. People are saying there is a God.
It's more specific than that.
Well, so let me ask you this. So if there is a God and there is a moral code and it doesn't come at your benefit, are you going to follow it?
It depends on how you define your benefit.
If it's going to come at your expense, would you still follow it?
That's what Christians do. Like, I don't know what people think the Bible is in terms of like, just do this and therefore you go to heaven, or just do this and then God looks at you favorably, because neither of which is true. Because it's not something that there's not anything that you can do to make God look upon you and be like, oh, gold sticker, like gold star, you're the best. But he also doesn't he looks at you through the lens of Christ. So once Christ has died on the cross for you, when you believe and when you follow him, and when you choose to confess that Jesus is Lord of your life, that is when God now looks at you and he's like, I don't see you and your mistakes and your sin and all of this mess. He's like, I see Jesus standing in your place, who is righteous, who is holy, who is perfect. He's my son. And also with the following these things that are for your benefit or not for your benefit, like as Christians we're told to die to our flesh, and that doesn't literally mean dying. It means the sin, the things that you've done in the past, like put them to death. Like, don't be continuing on in your old ways. Like, it talks a lot about the old man and the new man in the New Testament. I think it's the book of James actually, but I'm not 100% sure. And it talks about if you have died with Christ, then leave it there. Don't try and bring this old man and these old ways, this old person into your new life. And I think sometimes that we can have this idea of religion where it's like, oh, this is just a perfect person and they living life all Gucci and beautiful. But no, like if you talk to Christians and you ask them to share, some of their testimony or a testimony that they might have of like, some difficult times, if they're comfortable to share, like this is all for God's glory. Like there's times that I've been through that have really tried me, that have really been testing. And because of my faith, I've had to be like, okay, I can't go this certain direction. I have to go this other direction. And for in the world, you would say this is a sacrifice. Like this is something, like why would you do that? But as a Christian, I can look at God, I can read the scripture and know that what I'm doing is a good thing and it's a right thing. And even something as simple as going to the gym, having discipline and going to the gym, for example, that is a sacrifice. You're sacrificing your time, your energy, your comfort, but at the end of the day, it's for your benefit. It might not be for your comfort in the moment and your benefit in that way, but ultimately that discipline is going to give you so much more growth and good results at the end of the day. So having that lack of benefit in the moment is actually something that helps you in the long run. So yeah, let's continue on in the conversation.
If God came down and said, here is my moral code and you should follow it, but even if you follow it, you are still going to end up in hell, are you going to follow it?
Well, that was the question that was put to Job and to Christ, right? Because they were required. Hang on, I'm answering your question. They were required to withstand trials that would break anyone and maintain their upward orientation regardless.
And they did that with the motivation of believing that this omnipotent, all-loving God would somehow turn it into a benefit. So they still did it solely for their benefit. So
No,
when you,
yes, they did. Yes, they did. Hang on. Let's define benefit. Like, if I did something for your sister, would that be to your benefit? Like, how are you defining your benefit? Do you mean one of your whims gratified now? Or do you mean you and everyone you love and know over some reasonable span of time?
So when you're talking about whims, I think you're talking about something that's more dopamine. When you're talking about morality, you're talking about something that's more serotonin and more ultimately satisfying. So you and I agree on a lot. I mean, when it comes to talking about how men should be masculine and things of that nature, you and I are 100% in agreement. We just don't agree on the justification that God is the only thing that provides morality.
It's not a justification, it's a definition.
What's the difference then between a definition and a justification? I mean, it's ultimately psychologically the same thing.
Well, we have to define what we're talking about before we can just debate.
Okay, well,
right?
so here's my position.
I said that God, among other things...
I'm actually a non-theist. I'm not an atheist. I believe the human condition is one of uncertainty. And what that means is that I don't believe that you can conclude there is a God with certainty, and I don't believe that you can conclude that there is a God without in the same position. Now, with that, I don't care. I still wake up every day, and I have motivation to be a moral person.
Define moral.
Moral, what I ought to do.
Okay, and how do you come to that conclusion?
And what I ought to do, ultimately it comes down to what not just benefits me, but what benefits the entire planet, what benefits the entire system. I think that your entire moral perspective comes from linear thinking. And when you look at the reality of the universe, it's actually more so holistic. So when you look at how Aristotle defined God, when he said that there had to be an unmoved moved or an uncaused cause, he was defining God from a linear perspective. And you do the same with morality, and you do the same with purpose.
How does my definition of morality, how does my definition...
It's interesting because I think what he's saying, I can kind of understand it because, you know, this world it's big. And I don't think just because it's big that you have to use the word holistic, because you can also think linearly. Like, why can't you think in steps? Like that's perfectly fine, I think. And I think science does that as well. Holistic thinking has a lot of nuance in it, and I think in that nuance sometimes people can use it as a scapegoat to be like, well, you just can't draw any conclusions, whereas like you can come to solid conclusions through linear thinking, and it doesn't mean that it's wrong per se. So it's interesting to see if he has time to flesh that out before the red flags all go up.
Morality hypothetically differ from yours.
Because you're saying that there's something that exists in a vacuum, that it exists in and of itself, and nothing in the universe exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists in and of itself. It's a whole systems-based morality. It's a systems-based reality.
Is there a hierarchical
and that is
structure?
What the quantum...
Is there a hierarchical structure? Are some things more important than others?
Are some things, I think some things lead to more benefits than others.
Then, by your own definition, some things are more important than others.
Yes.
Okay.
What is... Pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.